October 27th, 1915, the Weddell Sea, Antarctica. 28 men stood on the ice and watched their ship die. Endurance had been locked in pack ice for nearly 10 months. Now the pressure was too great. The hull groaned, buckled, and began to take on water faster than anyone could stop it. Within hours, she was gone, swallowed beneath the surface as if she had never existed. They had no radio contact with the outside world. No rescue was coming. The nearest land capable of supporting life was over 800 miles away. What followed was not a story of heroism. It was a study in control and the very thin line between survival and collapse. As always, viewer discretion is strongly advised. What kept 27 men alive for nearly 2 years was not strength, not equipment, and not luck. It was one man's understanding of something most leaders never learn. Ernest Shackleton was 41 years old and already a failure by the standards of his era. He had attempted the South Pole twice. Twice, he had turned back. In 1914, when he announced the imperial trans-antarctic expedition, a full land crossing of the continent, the press treated it as his last serious bid for relevance. Over 5,000 men applied to join him. He selected 27. The ship was called Endurance. The name was deliberate. It came from his family motto, Fortitude Vincimus. By endurance we conquer. He had it carved into the ship's wheel. The men saw it every day. They departed London in August 1914. The same week, Europe declared war. Most of the crew expected to be gone 6 months. Some had left wives and children at home, with little more than a note on the kitchen table. By January 1915, Endurance was deep in the Weddell Sea, one of the most treacherous bodies of water on the planet. The ice there moves in slow, grinding rotations, driven by currents that have no regard for whatever sits on top of them. The ship became trapped before the crew fully understood what was happening. One morning the ice was close. By afternoon, it was pressing against the hull. By evening they weren't moving. For 9 months, they drifted. The men established routines to stay sane: chores, dog training, lectures, theatrical performances on deck. Shackleton understood something that most leaders of his time did not. Idle men in extreme conditions do not rest. They fracture. Among the crew, tensions were already forming along quiet fault lines. Frank Wild, his second-in-command, was steady and loyal. Ernest McNish, the ship's carpenter, was not. McNish was 40, older than most of the crew, and he did not believe in deference for its own sake. He questioned orders when he thought they were wrong. He did it openly, in a confined space with no horizon in sight. That kind of friction spreads. Shackleton watched all of it. He said very little. When Endurance finally went under in late October, the men retrieved what they could. 3 lifeboats, supplies for roughly 60 days, the sled dogs. They made camp on the ice itself, nearly 200 miles from the nearest land, with no certainty the ice would carry them in the right direction. It was here, not on the ship, not during the crossing, that the real survival began. Not survival from the cold, survival from each other. The ice camp they named Ocean Camp. It sat on a floe roughly the size of a city block, drifting northeast at the mercy of currents they could not predict. The men pitched tents, rationed food, and waited for the ice to carry them toward land. Shackleton divided the 27 men across 5 tents. The assignments looked random. They were not. He had been watching for weeks, tracking who ate in silence, who argued over small things, who gathered in corners after dark. Now he separated them deliberately. Men who gravitated toward each other's frustrations were placed in different tents. Men he considered potential instigators were distributed, so no single tent held more than one. McNish went into Shackleton's own tent. Keep your enemies close is a principle as old as leadership itself. Shackleton applied it without ever naming it. What the men didn't realize was that the social architecture of their camp had been engineered before a single peg was driven into the ice. By December, the ice had not moved them toward land. It had moved them away from it. The nearest viable destination, Paulet Island, where an emergency depot of supplies had been cached years earlier, was now further than when they had started. The current was pulling them in the wrong direction, slowly and without any drama, as if the oceans simply hadn't noticed them. Shackleton made a decision. They would march. 27 men, 3 lifeboats, equipment weighing nearly 2 tons. Across moving, unstable pack ice. Toward land they could not see. They lasted 2 days. The ice surface was too broken, too unpredictable. In some places it held. In others, men sank to their knees. The boats couldn't be dragged. The loads were too heavy. The progress too small. Less than 2 miles in 48 hours of brutal effort. Shackleton called a halt. He told the men they would return to camp and wait. He did not tell them he had no plan for what came next. The lifeboats had limits he hadn't fully understood until that moment. January brought a crisis that had nothing to do with the ice. McNish refused a direct order. The circumstances were specific. Dispute over whether the men were still under maritime law now that the ship was gone. But the meaning was broader than the argument itself. McNish believed that with endurance gone, Shackleton's legal authority over the crew had ended. He said so to other men. He let it sit in the air. In a functioning society, this is a labor dispute. On a drifting ice floe in the Weddell Sea, it is the first crack in a structure that cannot afford cracks. Shackleton did not punish him. He did not raise his voice. He called the entire crew together, read the ship's articles aloud, and stated clearly that the terms of employment remained in effect, regardless of the ship's condition. Then he moved on. But he remembered. What he didn't say, what he never said, was that McNish's defiance had spread faster than he expected. 3 other men had listened. 2 of them had nodded. This shift changed everything about how Shackleton managed the weeks that followed. April 1916. The ice beneath them was breaking apart. After 5 months on the floe, the camp itself was becoming dangerous. Leads, open channels of black water, were appearing and closing without warning. One morning a crack ran directly beneath one of the tents, while men were sleeping inside it. They launched the lifeboats. 3 small wooden vessels, open to the elements, carrying 27 men into the Drake Passage, one of the most violent stretches of ocean on the planet. The boats sat low in the water. Spray froze on the men's clothing within minutes. There was nowhere to sleep horizontally. They took turns bracing against each other for warmth. The men who had been enemies for months were now pressed against each other's bodies through the night. There are crew members who later described those nights in the boats as the most intimate of their lives. Not in any comfortable sense. In the sense that you cannot maintain hatred for someone whose warmth is keeping you alive. Shackleton had not planned this, but he understood it immediately. In due time, the ocean would do the work he could not do himself. They reached Elephant Island on April 15, 1916. It was the first time any of them had stood on solid ground in nearly 500 days. One man dropped to his knees and scooped wet rocks into his mouth. Not from hunger, from something older than hunger. The need to feel something that didn't move. Elephant Island was not a destination. It was a ledge, a rocky wind-scoured outcrop at the edge of the Antarctic convergence, with no inhabitants, no passing ships, and no reason for any rescue vessel to ever look there. The island appeared on almost no commercial charts. If they stayed, they would die. Slowly, and without anyone knowing where to look for the bodies. Shackleton spent one night on the beach. Then he made the only decision left. He would take 5 men and sail 800 miles to South Georgia Island, the nearest place with a human settlement. in the largest of the 3 lifeboats, a vessel 22 feet long, through the Drake Passage in winter. He told the remaining 22 men that he would come back for them. He did not know if that was true. What the men left behind didn't realize was that Shackleton had already decided who was coming with him before he announced it. And the selection had nothing to do with sailing ability. McNish was one of the 5. This was not accidental. McNish was the most skilled carpenter alive on that island. He had already modified James Caird, the lifeboat chosen for the crossing, raising the sides, fitting a makeshift deck, waterproofing the seams with whatever materials remained. Without him, the boat had no realistic chance of surviving open ocean. But there was a second reason. McNish was the man most likely to destabilize the 22 left behind. His presence on the island, through a winter with no rescue in sight, was a variable Shackleton could not fully control from 800 miles away. Removing him was not a punishment. It was architecture, the same logic as the tent assignments, applied to a larger scale. McNish understood this. He said nothing. He got in the boat. The 2 men would not speak of it directly for the rest of their lives. But McNish was the only one of the 5 whom Shackleton did not recommend for the Polar Medal when they returned to England. The reasons given were administrative. Everyone who was there knew better. The crossing of the Drake Passage took 17 days. There is no clean way to describe what that meant in practice. The James Caird was buried by waves so large the men could not see the horizon from the deck. They navigated by stars they could only glimpse between storm systems. The ballast shifted. The sleeping bags became so saturated with seawater they provided almost no warmth. 2 men showed early signs of what would now be recognized as hypothermia-induced psychosis. They spoke to people who weren't there, laughed at nothing, had to be physically prevented from standing up in the boat. On day 14, they spotted what appeared to be a break in the clouds. It was not clouds, it was a wave, a single wave, later estimated at 60 feet, that the entire crew saw forming simultaneously and had no ability to avoid. Shackleton, at the tiller, described it in his journal as the only moment during the entire expedition when he believed they would not survive. The boat went up the face of it, came over the top, came down the other side. It did not capsize. No one spoke for several minutes afterward. What they didn't realize was that the hardest part was still in front of them. And it had nothing to do with water. South Georgia Island was now less than a day away, but the landing site, the whaling station at Stromness, the only place with people and a radio, was on the opposite side of the island. Between them and it, an unmapped mountain range. No equipment, no map, no one had ever crossed it. Shackleton looked at the island and began planning the route. They crossed South Georgia on foot in 36 hours without stopping. 3 men, no sleeping bags, no climbing equipment, no map that showed anything useful past the coastline. They moved through the night, using a carpenter's adze as an ice axe and a length of rope they had brought from the boat. At one point, descending a slope in darkness with no way to judge what was below, Shackleton made a decision that had no rational basis. He told the men to coil the rope beneath them and slide, all 3 of them, into the dark. 1,500 feet. They landed in soft snow. They kept moving. On the morning of May 20th, 1916, they walked into the whaling station at Stromness. The station manager, a Norwegian named Thoralf Sørla, had known Shackleton before the expedition. He later said he did not recognize the man standing in front of him. Not because of the beard or the torn clothing or the smell, because of something in the face that he couldn't name. Shackleton arranged a rescue ship within hours. It took 4 attempts to reach Elephant Island. 3 times, pack ice turned the vessels back. On August 30th, 1916, 4 months and 16 days after Shackleton had left them, the ship broke through. All 22 men were alive. Frank Wild had maintained the daily routine Shackleton had established. Chores. Meals at fixed times. Small tasks that gave each day a shape. He had told the men every morning for 4 months to roll up their sleeping bags and be ready to leave. He had never allowed them to stop believing it was possible. Not one man had been lost, not to the cold, not to the ice, not to each other. Of the 27 men who had watched Endurance sink, every single one returned home. The expedition had failed completely in its stated objective. It had not crossed Antarctica. It had not mapped anything. It had produced no scientific data of consequence. The official records list the Endurance expedition as a failure. No crossing completed. No scientific data collected. No polar medal for the man whose hands kept the boat alive. History has a way of filing things incorrectly. Ernest Shackleton died in 1922 on a ship anchored off South Georgia Island. He was on his way to Antarctica again. He was 47. He is buried there, at his wife's request. On the same island, he walked across in the dark. McNish never received the Polar Medal. He died in 1930 in a charity ward in Wellington, New Zealand. The New Zealand Antarctic Society placed a bronze cat on his grave, a replica of the ship's cat he had carried across the ice. Some debts take a long time to acknowledge. If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching, and a special thanks to everyone who supports the channel on Patreon or as a channel member. If you're interested, we offer early access videos that are released roughly a week before the regular YouTube uploads. Also, if you have a story suggestion, feel free to submit it using the form found in the description. Anyways, thanks again, and hopefully, I will see you in the next one.